Hey, what is going on, guys? This is Jake at That Fit Friend, and today I'll be comparing the Reebok Nano X3 to the Reebok Nano X2. As always, everything is timestamped down below, but that being said, let's dive in. So 5 major construction differences to note between these models include number 1, their outsole construction. So over here in the X3, we have a reworked outsole tread patterning compared to the X2. The X2 had this full rubber outsole, it extended up over the toe box, and it has a traditional lug patterning. It is similar to the X1, so those outsoles did not change. In the X3, we have a now updated outsole. Over here in this shoe, we have a full rubber tread. It does wrap over the toe box as well. And then we have this split construction going from the midfoot to the forefoot. It almost reminds you of like the Metasplit tech that the Nano 8, 9, 10, etc. had. And then we also have the circular tread patterning back here on the heel. This heel actually compresses a little bit, and that is due to the lift and run chassis system, which I'll talk about in a minute. But overall, I like the tread patterning a little bit better on this shoe. I think it gives you a little bit more grip for multi-directional work and on different surfaces, so I do like this change with the X3. The second construction feature to note is the lift and run chassis system. So that is something new in the Nano X3. So essentially this black TPU here and this white TPU that wrap from the lateral midfoot around the heel over here to the medial midfoot, this is an internal system that the X2 did not have. So essentially what the lift and run chassis system is designed to do, and I actually have one right here, is it's designed to give you additional boot support, but give you a slightly more versatile feel during your workouts. So essentially this plate down here sits below the midsole in the heel of the shoe. And what it does is it compresses when you're lifting, but it gives you a nice level of pop when you're doing like short runs and jumps. And it took me a minute, but I did start to realize the difference between how the X3 feels versus the X2 for different workouts. And honestly, I like the versatility edge that the lift and run chassis system gives you in the X3. The third major construction difference to note is their upper constructions. So over here in the X3, we now have a flex weave upper, and then we have some synthetic and textile overlays wrapping from the midfoot into the heel. The heel has a nice amount of padding, and this lift and run chassis system gives the boot a nice level of support, so I don't think you'll run into slip issues with this model, and it's a little bit less harsh on the Achilles in my opinion. Over here in the X2, we have the knit upper, and then we have some textile overlays from the midfoot back here to the heel. We also have a decent level of boot and midfoot support due to these TPU layers here on the medial and lateral side of the shoe. One thing I will say is that the knit in this model I think could be a little bit spacious for certain foot anatomies, and the upper in the X3 feels a little bit more athletic, so it does hug the foot a little tighter, which I actually think is a good thing, and I think this model will fit a little bit more true for most folks regarding its overall upper volume. The fourth construction difference to note about these shoes is their Rope Pro tech on the midfoot. So in the X1 and the X2, the bane of this shoe's existence, I think, was its durability for rope climbs, especially if you were J-wrap climbing. So we have this Rope Pro tech, but we have this really sharp edge here with the outsole that kind of like wraps up over this TPU layer. And what would happen is essentially when you're climbing and putting a ton of stress in this shoe, because this sharp edge kind of bites the rope a ton, you'd have this start to lip over time. So the X2 was prone to breaking pretty quick for CrossFit specific workouts that had rope climbs. In the X3, the Rope Pro is a lot denser. We do not have that layer anymore, or that lip that kind of catches the rope, so this model is a lot more dense and it grips really well, and I have yet to have durability issues with the X3 regarding its rope climbing potential. Now, will that be the case for everybody? I'm not sure yet because we need more data points and testing on the shoe, but thus far in my training, I haven't had any issues, and a lot of the folks who have commented on my X3 review have also expressed that the midfoot has held up pretty well thus far in this model. The fifth and little subtle construction difference between these shoes is the overall tongue security. So over here in the Nano X2, you only have one loop that gives this tongue security at the top of the tongue here. Over here in the X3, you now have 2 loops. They sit a little bit lower on the tongue, which is nice because neither of these tongues are gusseted. So having this additional loop, or I think on the midfoot of this tongue, adds a little bit more tongue security with this model. And I do like this little change because I think it adds a slightly more secure fit to this model's tongue, especially when you're doing more athletic style training sessions. Now I will say one thing to note with this model's upper is that it can have a little bit of fold down here at the bottom if you tighten the shoe a ton. So it doesn't really impact performance, but it isn't the most aesthetically pleasing, so just something to note there. I also discussed that in my X3 review, but now let's talk about the performance differences between these shoes. All right, so now let's discuss some performance differences between the X3 and the X2. So which model is better for lifting? So I think if you're investing in one of these shoes for just recreational lifting and you just want it for some general strength work, honestly, both of these shoes will be pretty comparable. The stability is very similar in both of these shoes as well. You have the Reebok Float Ride Energy Foam midsole throughout, and then you also have a full rubber tread patterning on both shoes, so I don't think grip and traction will be an issue in either of these models. Thus far, I've deadlifted 500 pounds in these shoes, squatted 405 pounds, and their stability has been fine. So I do think for most lifters, you will be plenty fine with the stability in both of these shoes. Now, I would give the slight edge to the X3 if you had a gun to my head and you're like, pick one of these shoes right now, because I do think the lift and run chassis system gives you a slightly more stable heel. Also, there's a little bit less toe spring in this model, so you can ground the toes a little bit better for deadlifts, but overall, honestly, both of these shoes are pretty comparable when it comes to lifting. And if you're just using them for general strength training and you want to save a little bit of money, there's nothing wrong with the Nano X2, and I would suggest exploring that model. Now, which model is better for CrossFit? This is where I do think there's a pretty clear winner here. So the X2, don't get me wrong, works really well in most CrossFit contexts, and there are a lot of athletes that love this shoe. However, with its durability issue at the midfoot, I don't really like this shoe for CrossFit specific training, because if you're gonna be dropping $135 on a shoe, it shouldn't break after a couple of climbs, which I've had 2 other models do. In the X3, you have a slightly more athletic fit, so you do get a little bit more upper security. I also like how abrasion resistant the flex weave has been thus far, and with this reworked midfoot construction, I don't think you're gonna run into the same durability issue in this model that you did with the X2. Plus, with the lift and run chassis system, I did find this model to be a little bit more comfortable for short runs programmed in CrossFit WODs. So an example of this in action is during a WOD where I had faster 400-meter pace runs programmed, I was running on the Assault Runner, and because we have that arc construction, I typically will have a little bit of heel strike when I'm running. With this model's lift and run chassis system, it was a little bit more forgiving compared to the X2. Now again, the X2 works really well. It does have that durability issue, but if we're talking about a shoe that is purely better than the other, I think the X3 takes the edge here. When it comes to versatile training, I also really like the X3 compared to the X2. Now, again, the X2 works well, and I feel bad bashing this shoe because it is a very well-rounded training shoe, but with the reworked upper construction, I just feel a little bit more locked down in this model. Now, I have a neutral width foot, so I do slide a little bit in the X2, and once the knit stretches out a little bit more, I did slide a little bit in this model. I have yet to have that issue in this shoe. I like the overall tread patterning for different styles of movement, so if I'm doing multi-directional work or doing explosive work, the grip on the shoe is really exceptional. And once again, I do think that lift and run chassis system contributes to this style of training and giving you a slightly more forgiving and responsive ride in the Nano X3. All right, so now which model is better for short runs? So both of these shoes are once again pretty comparable. However, I do think the X3 has a slight edge for sprints and short fast-paced runs because of the lift and run chassis system, but both models I think are comparable with their overall comfort for certain mileages. I wouldn't run more than 2 miles in either of these shoes, so if you're planning to do short runs, both of these models will work. I do think the X3 is a bit more comfortable for sprints and faster paced runs once again, but if you're just gonna be doing like 400 meters, 800 meters, or even a mile here and there, both of these shoes should work. Granted, they will be a little bit more stable compared to a traditional running shoe, so just food for thought there before using these for running, but overall, they are pretty dang similar. All right, so now which model is better for daily wear? So for this section, I would actually give the slight edge to the Nano X2, and that is for 2 key reasons. Number 1, with this knit upper, it has a nice level of breathability, and number 2, it's a little bit more spacious. So I think for all day wear, this model can feel a bit more comfortable. You get a bit more volume through the forefoot of this shoe, so you can wear it a little bit looser and you'll have a bit more room compared to the snugger fit in the Nano X3. But both models I think will work for daily wear, but the X2 I think takes a slight edge due to the knit upper. So overall, these shoes are pretty comparable. However, I do think the X3 is a stronger shoe overall. It performs a little bit better for lifting. It performs exceptionally better for CrossFit and versatile training. And when it comes to short runs, it's also very comparable to the X2 with a slight edge for sprints and fast short pace runs. When it comes to daily wear, both models are pretty comparable, but I do think the X2 has a slight edge there. So when it comes to the sizing and fit of the Nano X2 and Nano X3, I do think there are some subtle differences to note. So over here in the Nano X2, most lifters and athletes will want to size down a half size. So if you have a narrow or neutral width foot, size down a half size in the shoe. If you have a wide foot, you should be pretty safe going true to size in the X2. Over here in the X3, we have a similar last construction. So the base and width of the shoe are comparable to the X2, but with the upper volume fitting a little bit snugger, I actually found this shoe to fit a little bit more true to size. So if you have neutral width feet and you like a snugger fit, go down a half size. If you have neutral width feet like myself and you do want a little bit of room at the end of your toe box, I would say go true to size. For wide feet, go true to size, and then for narrow width feet in the Nano X3, go down a half size. Overall though, I'm really curious to see where folks land with the sizing of these shoes. I think the X3 has a little bit more of a true to size feel and fit to them for a wider range of foot anatomies, but those are the main fit differences to note between the Nano X2 and the Nano X3. So when it comes to the price differences of the X2 and the X3, you can expect to pay $135 USD for the Nano X2 and $140 USD for the Nano X3. Now, with the Nano X3's release, the Nano X2 has been on sale, so if you're not necessarily worried about using the X2 for CrossFit and the durability issue that comes along with that model in that context, honestly, I would say save money and go for the X2. I think objectively the X3 is the stronger shoe in the gym, but if you're trying to save a little bit of money, go for the X2 or search around for coupons and sales on the X3 to knock down that price point a little bit. All right, now let's cover the weight, heel toe drop, and insole in the X3 and the X2. Over here in the X2, for my size 10 model, we have a weight of 11.90 ounces. Over here in the X3, we have a weight of 13.20 ounces. So we have seen a weight increase in the Nano X3. Both of these models still feature 7mm heel toe drops, and we have removable foam insoles in both of these models. Now, with these shoes uppers, I do think the Nano X2 can be a slightly more orthotic friendly shoe. So if you do wear custom orthotics, the X2 might work better for your needs because you do get a little bit more upper volume in this shoe. All right, so now let's break down some construction differences between these shoes up close. So over here in the X3 and in the X2, you do have an extended outsole layer that wraps up over the toe box. You do have a little bit of a toe guard in both of these shoes. It's not super rigid, but it does give you a nice level of additional security. Looking at the upper constructions in these shoes, in the Nano X3, we have a flex weave upper that wraps from the forefoot into the midfoot, and then we have some textile lining back here through the midfoot and the heel. We do have a slightly more padded heel in the shoe, and we have that lift and run chassis system that helps contribute to your overall ankle support in this model. In the Nano X2, we have a knit upper, and then we have some textile lining through the midfoot and the heel. We also have a padded heel, and then we also have these TPU layers that extend from the midfoot and then wrap back here into the heel. Looking at the midsole of this shoe, we have a float ride energy foam that extends the entirety of the shoe, so through the forefoot and then back here through the heel, and that is pretty consistent to the Nano X3's midsole, so we still have that float ride energy foam in the forefoot and heel of this shoe, and then through the midfoot. Looking at the Rope Pro construction on the X3, it's a little bit more dense, and as you can see, there's not a ridge here that gets caught nearly as much on ropes, so that's why I think this model is also a little bit more durable for that context when training. I like it. It's a good change overall. It is very much more dense than what you get in the X2. In the Rope Pro in the X2, you have this sharp ridge here. And then once again, this is what gets caught up on rope and kind of like pulls this rubber off of this TPU. So once again, you're not gonna have the best durability with the shoe regarding its performance for rope climbs. Looking at the midfoot constructions and the tongues, over here in the Nano X2, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 core eyelets that wrap up with a 7th back here for lace lock. We have an additional loop here on the tongue towards the top of the tongue, and then the tongue itself is not gusseted, and it is a padded mesh. Looking at the tongue and lacing system in the Nano X3, we have once again 6 core eyelets that wrap up with a 7th back here for lace lock. This tongue has 2 loops, they are lower on the tongue, and we also have that padded mesh tongue as well, and it is not gusseted. Again, in the Nano X3, you can have a little bit of material overlap down here. Check out my individual review for that in action, because I do highlight that a little bit more in the con section of that review. And then looking at the outsoles, we have a full rubber tread patterning on both shoes. Over here in the X2, we have a traditional lug patterning, and then over here in the X3, we have like these grooves that go throughout, and then this split tech that runs from the forefoot into the midfoot, and then back here on the heel, once again, I think you can see it a little bit. It does have a little bit of compression there because of that lift and run chassis system serving as that slight dome here that gives you a slightly more versatile fit overall. And then once again, both of these shoes do have thin foam removable insoles, so you can take them out and put your own insoles in, and they are pretty comparable in size, which is why I also think when it comes to the last construction of these shoes, they are comparable, but the upper fitting a little bit more snug in the X3 gives it a slightly truer fit. If you have additional questions on the X3 or X2's construction or how they compare, drop a comment down below. All right guys, that wraps up my comparison of the Nano X2 and the Nano X3. I really enjoy the Nano X3 and I think it's a step in the right direction for the Nano shoe line, but if you have additional questions on either of these shoes, how to size them, or which model is best for your training context, drop a comment down below or reach out to me personally, whichever you prefer. And as always guys, drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.